So how many of you came this morning with an idea that cannibalism is a bad thing? Oh, I should really see more hands. That's a bit disconcerting. That being said, my goal today is for each of you to walk out of here at least with an understanding of the reasons that cannibalism exists and how we might be unknowingly participating in symbolic cannibalism today. I hope it's just symbolic cannibalism. So, we're going to talk about cannibalism across the South Pacific, and I'm also going to address ideas of cannibalism around the world, where cannibalism received its origins, and how cannibalism connects almost all peoples from the Paleolithic time until today, and even before the Paleolithic era. So the goal is to help you see and understand cannibalism today in a new light. So my hope is that you can open your eyes and your understanding a little bit today to see cannibalism, if that's possible, in a new way. And at the end, I'm going to have a bit of a surprise for you, including, of course, a really great cannibalism joke, right? I mean, I can't do a lecture about cannibalism without a great cannibal joke. So there's not going to be a lot of vivid images here, but there will be some, and there will be some crude references. So if you're bothered by that sort of thing, you could probably watch it on television, and then you can just turn me off a little bit if you'd like to. But we're going to get started talking about the history of cannibalism. We'd like to think that cannibalism is a deviant, scarcely practiced behavior, but evidence of cannibalism abounds throughout human history. In some of the early cave paintings, we see actually, this is obviously a recreation, but we see some evidence of cannibalism and drawings of cannibalism from early prehistoric days. In fact, we've actually found carefully defleshed bones from 600,000 years ago. And there is a skull that's been found that was actually defleshed of all of its meat over 2 million years ago. The oldest Homo sapien bones from Ethiopia show signs of cut marks, which show that the bones were stripped of flesh. Some anthropologists think that ritual cannibalism was common in human societies prior to the beginning of the Upper Paleolithic era. Now, the Upper Paleolithic era, it would be probably any time from 50,000 till 10,000 years ago. So if you keep that in mind when you think about the Paleolithic era. And this is based on the large number of butchered bones that were found in Neanderthal and other lower and middle Paleolithic sites. Neanderthals, most of us are distant cousins, were believed to have practiced cannibalism, which may have led, in fact, to Neanderthals being cannibalized by early modern humans. Cannibalism in the lower and middle Paleolithic era may have actually occurred because of food shortages. So when we think about the ice ages coming, these people going from a land of plenty to now a land covered in ice and snow, how did they survive? And cannibalism is one of the answers for this. It's also been suggested that removing dead bodies through ritual cannibalism might have been a means for predator control. For example, when we know today that after major epidemics in, say, India and Africa, when large numbers of bodies are left outside, it increases the amount of large cat predation on humans. And so consequently, early humans may have understood this, and this is before the ideas of burial or cremation. They may have simply cannibalized these people instead of leaving the animals out for the large cats to come and to control predation. Now it's about talking about modern human cannibalism. Most of us think that cannibalism is something that is aberrant or that wasn't a large part of our human development, and yet it was practiced by humans in prehistoric Europe, Middle America, Mesoamerica, which would be Mexico all the way down through Panama, South America, among the Iroquois of the United States, of North America, I should say, the Maori of New Zealand. We have the Solomon Islands, West Africa, Fiji, Central Africa, Polynesian, New Guinea, and Sumatra. And these are just a few of the places that we know have practiced some level of cannibalism in relatively modern times. Evidence of cannibalism has also been found with the ancestral Puebloans of the southwest United States. In England, in Goss Cave, bones of around 14,000 years of age have been found, and suggesting that these may have also been cannibalized. And they found the human skull apart, and with evidence that the human skull had been used as a drinking vessel. This is a very common use of the human skull, just in case you have some laying around. Just sharing that. In 2001, archaeologists at the University of Bristol found evidence of Iron Age cannibalism in Gloucester. Cannibalism was practiced as recently as 2,000 years ago in Great Britain. So, at the time of Jesus, at the time of the Roman Empire, in Britain, cannibalism was being practiced. Now we'll talk about the early history of cannibalism around the world. Cannibalism was practiced in ancient Egypt, in Roman Egypt, and in famines such as the famine in the year 1201. So we're going to see some similarities here of various cultures practicing cannibalism. Herodotus, the ancient Greek historian, observed two types of cannibalism in his time. Number one, the reverential eating of one's own dead, and the triumphant demolition of one's enemies. Beautifully said for something completely grotesque. But it's so true, and this plays itself out in culture after culture, that bodies were consumed not just for the food element, but it was meant to convey respect or to show a tremendous level of disrespect. The Aztecs of Mexico were known for their bloodthirsty cannibalism. In fact, the high priests would flay their prisoners, some of them, most of them, alive, and would remove the beating heart from their body, show it to the victim as they died, and then hold the still beating heart up. At times he would take a bite of it and then pass it down to the other high priests. Fijian warriors ate their enemies as a mark of respect, and others ate their enemies as a sign of disrespect. They would eat them very crudely, like they would eat a fresh kill. The tribes of Papua New Guinea believed that by eating the hearts and the brains of their family and friends, they would take on their desirable qualities. So keep in mind what we're talking about here. Eating the body, drinking the blood, to gain the desirable qualities from these individuals, from these people. Some of them may have been their enemies, in fact. In Tunisia, Polybius records that it was suggested to Hannibal Barca that he should employ cannibalism to ensure that he had a consistent food supply for his troops. It was suggested that he bring along whole groups of people who would do the cleaning and the cooking, and that if they ran into food shortages, those who were not considered to be useful warriors would be consumed for the benefit of the troops. In Jerusalem, cannibalism was reported by Josephus during the siege of Jerusalem by Rome in 70, Common Era. So again, we're seeing even more recent use of cannibalism. Reports of cannibalism were recorded in the 11th century during the First Crusade, as crusaders were alleged to have eaten the body of their Muslim foes at the siege of Ma'ara. During the Great Famine of 1315 to 17 in Europe and North Africa, there were many reports of cannibalism among the starving population. In these places, cannibalism was resorted to as a last resort in times of famine. In Morocco, the Moroccan Muslim explorer Ibn Battuta reported that one African king advised him that nearby there were people who were cannibals. But he said, hey, you guys are okay. You Christians and Arabs were safe because you guys are really unripe and they're going to probably fall ill if they eat you. So it was actually spread to these people that to eat an Arab or to eat a Christian was really unsafe for them. So we're going to find that there's some ways to make yourself unappealing. In China, during the Tang Dynasty, cannibalism was supposedly resorted to by rebel forces early in the period by raiders. Eating an enemy's heart and liver was also claimed to be a feature that was both an official punishment and a personal vengeance. It's understood that the people of Middle America from Mexico through Panama practiced a great deal of human sacrifice, but we're really not sure about how widespread it was. At one extreme, one anthropologist has stated that he believes that eating the flesh of another human being was largely practiced by the priests, by the chiefs, by the leaders, because they were really lacking in protein, and so it was added to their diet to supplement, and so it was really a very rich food that was only reserved for the Aztec royalty, if you will. In the Caribbean, Christopher Columbus actually coined the word cannibal. And he did it quite by accident, because in his report, he wrote about the flesh-eating Carib people. But as you can see here, the Carib tribe, someone must have carried that R a little bit lower, and it was misunderstood as cannibs. And so consequently, when it was reported that there were cannibs, they called them cannibals. So if they had gotten it right, they'd all be called caribals. Wouldn't that be nicer? It just seems like a much nicer way of addressing it. So indeed, the idea of this mispronunciation and misunderstanding led to the understanding and the use of the word today as we know it as cannibal. In fact, the word for eating another human being wasn't even a word until the 15th century when Christopher Columbus reported it. Cannibalism was practiced recently as a tool of war, even in the 21st century. For those of you who've watched the Liberian rebels, the Congolese rebels, Rwandan rebels, you've probably seen reports that some of these groups wander the jungles, and where they can no longer find bushmeat of monkeys or gorillas, they will kill a human being and they will eat humans, sustaining some of these young tribal members and these young rebels with the blood and the flesh of human beings as they continue to fight. Our fascination with cannibalism is one common element throughout all of humanity. Most of us find it grotesque, abhorrent, and yet, like an accident on the side of the highway, we'll slow down and look at it for as long as we possibly can until someone else notices that we're watching it, and then we move quickly along. This is what's interesting for most social scientists, is to try to understand what is so engaging about the topic of cannibalism. And for anthropologists, it challenges us to understand what is truly right and wrong. Because while most of us will hold the idea that eating another human being is inherently or intrinsically wrong, what we're going to see is that there are many times among many groups of people for long periods of time that was not the case. That it has been accepted to eat human beings, and not only accepted, but encouraged for religious beliefs. Now we're going to talk about the types of cannibalism. You thought that there was only one type of cannibalism, didn't you? You are in for such a treat now. So, not only is there just cannibalism, but we have survival cannibalism and ritual cannibalism, and there are 6 more distinctions. Survival cannibalism can be traced back to prehistoric times. A 2-million-year-old cranium was once found with cut marks, suggesting that the skull was carefully defleshed We're not sure if it was for consumption or not, but one can assume. In extreme conditions, cannibalism is still practiced today. And then it's broken down into necro-cannibalism and homicidal cannibalism. Necro-cannibalism, probably many of you remember the Uruguayan flight that was the movie Alive was made from. These survivors ate the body of the victims who had died on that crash. So now how many of us would say that that was wrong? Right. This is where it gets interesting. We talk about cannibalism as an inherent wrong, and yet most of us now understand in this circumstance, when it comes to the eating of another human being who is dead, to keep others alive, it becomes understandable. Also, emaciated citizens during the siege of Leningrad were also reported to have eaten the bodies of victims fallen during World War II. Now, homicidal cannibalism is another topic altogether. In the case of the Republic versus Dudley and Stevens, this is back in 1880, two men were found guilty of murdering a cabin boy while adrift at sea. They set the precedent. They were actually convicted of murder, and setting the precedent that necessity is no defense of murder. How many of you have heard of the case of Jeffrey Dahmer from the United States? Well, I have a special story for you, and there's not many people who have this story. I was at school at Marquette University on 23rd and Wisconsin Avenue in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, during the time that Jeffrey Dahmer was alive and doing his business. He lived only 2 blocks away from the seminary where I was at school. And from time to time, I believe in particularly 2 occasions, he actually came to the seminary and came inside to pray inside of the seminary chapel. Obviously a very troubled and disturbed person, but we see here now that there are some people who actually equate cannibalism with some sort of sexual satisfaction as well. And he preyed on his victims and would decapitate them, cut up their bodies, and then put them in his freezer. And then he would eat them slowly. These sorts of things are obviously very strange for us to understand. And yet, when we take a look at these aberrations, they're aberrations in some respects because they're very uncommon. And yet, if they were to take a look at this over the course of human history, it wouldn't be seen as terribly uncommon to kill and eat your victims. Ritual cannibalism is further broken into 2 subtypes. Exocannibalism, which is the eating of outsiders, such as enemies captured in war or foreigners who wandered into another tribe's territory. The Wari people of the Amazon, for those of you who are on the recent cruise up the Amazon, we talked about the Wari people. And the Wari will actually kill an enemy, and they will eat it voraciously with their hands. They'll cook it, roast it over the fire, and they'll fight for these pieces of meat because it's such a prized possession. And they will eat it as though they were eating a big kill. In the book Savage Harvest, Carl Hoffman claims that Michael Rockefeller, the son of Vice President Nelson Rockefeller, while he was out getting pieces of primitive artwork for his father's collection, came up missing and was actually cannibalized by one of the tribes. There's exocannibalism, which is eating an outsider. And now we'll talk about endocannibalism, the eating of insiders or the members of one's own family or community. The Wari tribe of the Amazon also practiced funerary cannibalism. So when a member of the Wari tribe passed away, the family would gather together. And by the time that the funeral took place, the body, because they weren't embalming or doing anything to prepare the body was already starting to putrefy in the humid air. So the families would then wail elaborately, and they would all come together to delicately eat pieces of the deceased person. And they would eat these pieces of the deceased person because it was a part of their grieving process. For the Wari, eating this piece of them in a very ceremonial way, not wanting to, but doing it out of respect, was meant to signify that the person who had died was now out of the realm of the living and was no longer one of them, but it was an acceptable form of prey. For the Wari, these insider-outsider distinctions are important. Eating an outsider, if you were an outsider, you did not count as a human. You were not one of them. How similarly have we seen this in our world, even in our own present time, that if you're not like me, if you're different from me, you don't count. You don't have the same mana. You don't have the same spiritual presence as I do. And so they would eat these outsiders because they were considered to be other. So because of these two distinctions, they ate human beings, but if you asked a Wari, are you a cannibal? They would say absolutely not, because in their mind they are eating something that is no longer human. In the Amazon also, the tribe called the Yanomami tribe actually burns the victim completely. So when a person dies or a warrior has died, they will burn the body completely, and they will mix the bones and the ashes and all of these things into the regular meals, and people will eat this to consume the spirit of that person. And this is meant, again, to keep the spirit of that person alive. If you wanted to believe that someone who is special to you, a special member of your community, had died, that's an awful feeling. But now if we eat this person in a ceremonial way, we keep this person with us, and it continues to engender, this person's spirit continues to live on in us and our children and successive generations. And when we think about it in this way, doesn't cannibalism become a beautiful thing? It does, in the most strange sort of ways. And our minds help us understand that. They help us understand and associate with these people because we understand why they do it. Now we'll talk about cannibalism in the South Pacific. So cannibalism was practiced in New Guinea, in the Solomon Islands, and parts of Melanesia. And Fiji, as many of you know, was also known as the Cannibal Isles. So what are the reasons for cannibalism? We'll say that there's probably three significant reasons. Of course, there are more, but we break them down into three. The first one being hunger. People were hungry, and they didn't mind the taste. Some people liked the taste of another human being. To acquire a person's power or mana, that if we understand that another person has a significant presence and we want to have that person's spiritual presence, we would eat that person in order to gain their spiritual presence. And the third reason would be to show respect by eating them or to show disrespect. Either way, both equally valid. Hunger. As many Polynesians traveled from island to island, they realized that they hadn't brought enough food. And so as people died, or they would need to kill someone to be able to keep the rest of the group alive as they traveled on their voyages. And then when they arrived to their destination, they realized that maybe they liked the taste of human flesh. And so consequently, this practice continued on. And in order to continue on, and not seem savage, because there's something about it that still strikes people as difficult to understand, and it did for them as well. So they would create ritual reasons to continue this practice of cannibalism. So where hunger may have been the start, over time, to justify the continuance of cannibalism, they created reasons and rituals and religious beliefs that allowed them to continue with this practice. Acquiring mana. A tribal chieftain might eat the body or the heart of a worthy adversary on the battlefield. In fact, in Polynesian culture, I was telling another gentleman the other day that I have a ceremonial chieftain's dagger that is made out of coconut wood, and all around it, it has the serrated edges of shark's teeth. And I bought this in the North Pacific island of Karitimas, known as Christmas Island. And the gentleman explained to me that in Polynesian times, on the battlefield, when a warrior had been defeated, the chief would come from behind as he was kneeling, would slice his throat, and then they would hold a bowl to get the blood, and then they would use that to puncture and to take out his heart, and then they would eat the heart, passing it around to the other warriors, so that all of the warriors on the enemy side would be able to get the spiritual manna and the power and the victorious spirit of this person that they just defeated on the battlefield. So keep in mind these images of eating the body and blood, because they're important images that bind almost all cultures and religions. Disrespect. So while some would eat the blood and the flesh of a human being to show respect and to gain that manna, others would eat this flesh in an undignified manner to show them that they didn't respect them. And it's sometimes on the field, if it was a particularly nasty adversary, they would take the meat, throw it to the dogs, and then they would kill the dogs and burn the dogs, so that this manna was never again to be passed on, that it was completely dead to all human life. In the South Pacific, Reverend John Williams was perhaps one of the most famous missionaries. He came to the South Pacific Islands to Christianize them, and he met a very, very savage death. He was actually thought to have been cannibalized by the people of these islands. With his fellow missionary, James Harris, he stepped ashore in New Hebrides, and they were immediately captured. 15 months later, a Royal Navy ship came back, and they had confirmed that they had both killed and eaten both Harris and Williams. You've been called a lot of names, I'm sure, but this is perhaps one of the ugliest names I've ever heard for a human being, called a long pig. A long pig is an antiquated term for human flesh eaten by cannibals. Early explorers and missionaries were told that they were called long pigs because when the people of the islands ate human beings, they tasted a great deal like pork, and we were much longer, so we got the clever name long pigs. Cannibalism was part of the traditional culture in Papua New Guinea and survived in isolated pockets all the way into colonial Australian rule. Thoreau wrote, "It was a theory of mine that former cannibals of Oceania now feasted on spam because spam came the nearest to approximating the porky taste of human flesh. Long pig, as they called a cooked human being in much of Melanesia." Mortuary cannibalism. Most people didn't know anyone lived in the highlands of Papua New Guinea in the 1930s until Australian gold prospectors arrived and found a population of nearly 1 million people. Imagine a group of people, 1 million strong, living in the highlands of Papua New Guinea. This is the Forde tribe, and some of you have probably heard of this tribe or read about them. But every year, about 2,000 people a year have been dying of an inexplicable illness. And the disease was called kuru, which means shivering or trembling disease. They had trouble walking. Would lose control of their limbs. And they would start laughing uncontrollably. And it was actually called the laughing death. Within a year of contracting this disease, they couldn't get up off the floor, they couldn't feed themselves, and they couldn't control their bodily functions. So within a year of contracting this disease, they would effectively die in an awful state of deliria. Many locals were convinced it was a result of sorcery, but they were concerned that the disease was primarily hitting adult women and children younger than 8 years old. In some villages, there were almost no young women left, and this was causing the tribal chieftains to become very concerned because they saw the effective decline and decimation of their tribes. So they found out that they were practicing a rare type of funerary ritual. And in this funerary ritual, the dead are consumed. In many New Guinea villages prior to 1960s, many of these villages cooked and consumed their dead, and it was considered an act of grief. So when we think about it, you put the body out. They didn't bury them, but you put the body out, and the maggots get to it, right? If you bury it, the worms get to it. Isn't it better that we should eat this person that we love than to have the worms or the maggots get to them? So, in fact, the woman would remove the brains, mix it with ferns, and cook it in tubes of bamboo. They fire cooked and ate everything except the gallbladder. It's just not a good piece. It was primarily the adult women who ate the deceased bodies because their bodies were thought to be able to hold in the evil spirits of the person who had died. So they didn't want the men to eat them because the men obviously were weaker than the women, but the women can control these dead spirits and control them from getting out. So the women consumed the dead and gave it a safe place inside their own body, thereby protecting the rest of the tribe. And of course, as mothers often do, when their children are standing by, they pass little pieces of it to their children, right? So unknowingly, these women were consuming these bodies with disease, and they were passing it along to their children. Thankfully, since the 1960s, this practice has stopped and the population is rebalanced and is stable. Another tribe in New Guinea is called the Korowai tribe. They hadn't been discovered until the 1970s, if you can believe it. Until then, no previous contact had been made between them and the modern world, and it's thought that they had no idea that anyone existed outside of their tribe. They live in 140-foot high tree houses. Imagine what it takes to create those. Above the forest canopy, and they're designed to protect them from rival villagers. So the only way of accessing these areas is by wooden ladders placed up against the stilts to reach all the way to the top. And the Korowai tribe is one of the last known tribes of cannibals. Because of this, the Korowai would eat and kill a person that they believed had been possessed by a demon. So again, if the person was believed to have been possessed or to have some sort of a demon in his body, this person was killed and eaten to control the demon. There is talk that there is still this practice is carried out today. However, that's generally just told by the tour guides to scare you good people. But we never know. In 2012, several cult members allegedly ate their victims' brains raw and made soup from their penises. They openly admitted what they had done because the people that they had killed and eaten practiced sanguma, or sorcery. So again, they acknowledged in their mind, and they freely admitted that they had killed and eaten these people, but it was okay to do so because they were eliminating sorcerers, and they needed to get rid of these people because these people had been extorting money and demanding sex from poor villages for their supernatural services. And so by eating these witch doctors, they were able to receive the spiritual presence of these witch doctors and to hold down the evil spirits inside of them so that they would no longer be a problem for the average villager. In the Marquesas, they ritualistically killed their captives and then ate them. It was a great triumph among the Marquesans to have a human body and to eat it. First, they broke their legs to stop the person from running away. Then they would break the person's arms to stop them from fighting back. And then it was an unhurried killing. They would watch them and often torture them because they felt that it was a good form of entertainment. And also they believed that the longer that a body was alive and that was fed well, even though it was being tortured, that it would actually become a softer flesh if it was allowed to sit longer. So they would skewer the man and then roast and eat the person. For those of you who are going ashore in Nukuhiva, you'll have an opportunity to hear a little bit about Herman Melville's book Taipi. He actually helped shape the image of cannibals in the Marquesas. In his 1846 novel, he wrote that he had seen a particularly interesting container in the village square, and when he opened it up, he found parts of a human skeleton, the bones still fresh with moisture. Traditional Marquesan culture went extinct more than 100 years ago, and the last reported case of human sacrifice was in 1880. The Marquesans were Christianized starting in the mid-19th century, and they almost died out as a result of the disease and opium brought in by outsiders. As their numbers dwindled, their customs also vanished. In 1842, it said that there were about 12,000 people on Nukuhiva. And by 1934, there were only 634 left. Today, there are 2,300 people living on Nukuhiva. So we'll almost be doubling their population with the crew and the staff and us when we arrive. There was a recent case of cannibalism in the Marquesas in Nukuhiva in 2011. Stefan Rahmen, a German on holiday with his girlfriend, went missing, and they found pieces of him next to a fire. The man who was responsible was caught and was incarcerated. They say that the best way to avoid these cannibals is to make yourself as unappealing as possible. And it's good that you guys have already started the process, so well done. Easter Island. Every Eastern Islander knows that his relatives are kaitangata, which is man-eaters. Imagine being able to say that about your relatives, that your relatives are man-eaters. Some people are proud to say it because they understand it's a part of their heritage, while others take a great offense. Cannibalism didn't disappear from Easter Island until after the introduction of Christianity. Shortly before this, they were said that 2 Peruvian traders arrived and they were eaten. And when I asked the governor of Easter Island why this happened, they said, well, everyone loves Peruvian food. So cannibal feasts were held in secluded spots, and women and children were rarely admitted. And the reason that women and children were rarely admitted is because they were often on the menu. The fingers and the toes were the choicest morsels. The captives that were destined to be eaten were kept in huts in front of the sanctuaries until the moment when they were sacrificed to the gods. And you will see the same sort of sacrifice throughout the Caribbean, even with, for those of you who are studies of faiths, there are some modern faiths that are predominant now in Cuba. And in these faiths, they will eat the animals. And they will, first of all, they'll kill the animals. They'll spill the blood on the stones. And then they will eat the animals, but only after the spiritual power has been received by the gods. So they don't want to waste the animals. And in the same ways here, the spirit of these people was sacrificed to the gods, but so as to not waste the body, then they would eat the body. On Easter Island, this type of cannibalism was not exclusively a religious rite. It was sometimes the expression of an urge or revenge, but more often than not, it was simply to satisfy the urge and the taste for human flesh. And women and children were often the victims. In Tonga, William Mariner and Dr. John Martin actually wrote an account. And this is a bit long and it's quite detailed, but I'm going to read it for you because I think it's interesting to see how people reported on cannibalism back in these days. The Hapai men returned with about 15 prisoners. Some of the younger chiefs who had contracted the Fiji habits proposed to kill the prisoners and then roast and eat them. The proposal was readily agreed to by some because they liked this sort of diet, by others because they wanted to try it, thinking it manly and warlike to do so. Some of the prisoners were soon dispatched. Their flesh was cut up into small portions, washed with seawater, wrapped in plantain leaves, and roasted under hot stones. 2 or 3 of them were also baked whole, the same as a pig. The carcass was rubbed over with the juicy substance of the banana tree. And for those of you who are interested, we're about to prepare a recipe now, so you might want to get your notebooks out. Just after which it was thrown for a few minutes on the fire. Then when it was warm, it was scraped with mussel shells or knives and then washed. It was laid next on its back, and then the cook cut open the throat and drew forth the windpipe and gullet, passing a skewer behind them and tied a string right tight around the latter, afterwards to be divided. The whole inside of the carcass was next filled with hot stones, each wrapped in breadfruit leaves, and all the apertures were closed up quickly with plugs of leaves. The carcass was then laid with the belly downwards in a hole in the ground with hot stones, a fire having previously been made there for that purpose. A few other branches were then laid across the back of the carcass, and plenty of banana leaves strewn, or rather heaped, over the hole, upon which again a mound of earth was raised so that no steam could escape. The liver, as aforementioned, was first placed beside the carcass, and sometimes yams also. By these means, the carcass could very well be cooked in about a half an hour. In Hawaii, they reported the death of Captain Cook in 1779. This was reported by Captain King. At 8 o'clock, it being very dark, a canoe was paddling towards the ship, and they were concerned because they didn't know why they would be approaching them. But these Hawaiians came aboard, and they threw themselves at their feet, and they were just very frightened. They were terrified at what had happened and what might happen to them. They were lamenting with an abundance of tears at the loss of Orono. Orono was the name given affectionately to Captain Cook. And one of them told that they brought a part of his body. So they then presented them with a small bundle wrapped up in cloth, which he'd brought under his arm. And when they revealed it, it was about 9 or 10 pounds of human flesh of Captain Cook. They said that this was all that remained of the body of Orono, and the rest of the pieces were cut and burnt, and that they were now the possession of Teriobo, the supreme monarch. So we asked the question, was Captain Cook eaten? Many people think that Captain Cook was cannibalized. And while he was killed, and yes, he was cooked, his meat was never consumed because these people were not cannibals. They believed, much as people from Easter Island as well, that the spiritual presence resides in the bones. And so they wanted to strip all of the bones of the flesh so that they could hold on to these bones, and they would often wrap them in cloth, put them in a special place, and then bring them out every year on the date or close to the date when they had killed this person, to remember this person well, to tell stories, and to receive this person's spiritual mana. In fact, for those of you who have been to Easter Island, you've seen the large moai. In some parts of these moai, and just a couple of them, there are actually drawers that were underneath. And in the moai that were meant to house, they were meant to signify and typify the person, a chief or an important person on the island. When this person died, they would strip the bones of all of the flesh, and they would put these bones in the drawer and wrap them up. And then once a year, they would bring out these bones to pay respect to these bones. Keep in mind that this is a very similar practice that most Catholics have and Christians have with the saints, that we will actually keep relics or pieces of these bones close by. In New Zealand, cannibalism actually has its roots in the mythology of New Zealand. Rongo, the god of the kumara; Tane, the god of trees and birds; Tangaroa, the god of sea and fish; Almea, the god of the fern root; and Tu, the god of war, were all the children. These demigods were all brother, and Tu, the god of war, ate them all. What an interesting analogy, that the god of war is all-consuming, and it eats all good things. And so in a physical manner, they believed that this god of war ate its brothers. And this story also goes back ages before when we think about the Greeks. When you think about the two first gods of the Greek myths, you have Uranus and you have Gaia, the father sky and the earth mother. And they gave birth to their son Kronos. Kronos had many children, but understanding that he was going to be killed by one of his children by prophecy, he ate all of his children. But his wife Rhea actually kept aside their youngest son Zeus. And instead of giving him the son Zeus to eat, she gave him a stone wrapped in a leaf, and he ate it. And then later on, as Zeus grew up, he knew that he had to take care of his father, and so to fulfill the prophecy, he killed his father, opened up his father's stomach, and brought out all of the other gods, that his brothers and sisters that had been eaten. And then these brothers and sisters gathered together and then fought against the Titans. So this same type of story is present thousands of years prior and in completely different parts of the world. And so the question becomes, why? What is it that connects us? Cannibalism was also used to receive mana, so people were eating people to be able to receive, in New Zealand, to receive their physical and spiritual presence. So if you ate a strong warrior, you would receive all the benefits of this strong warrior. They would also eat people as a means of revenge. Sometimes they would take a person and they would throw him on hot stones to watch him die from this awful burning. And then they would cut him with a cannibal knife called the tuatini. And you can see here the serrated edges from the teeth of sharks or other animals. And in many cultures, but particularly here as well, the skull was used as a drinking vessel. And sometimes they would actually use a freshly killed skull. They would clean it out, and then they would, if they were going to another tribe, they would kill the chief, cut off his head, use the head as a drinking, use the skull as a drinking vessel in front of the chief's wife and children. It was a way of demonstrating that they were now completely and fully subjugated. Interestingly, in 2003, a report from Science magazine uncovered that in many human brains, we have a gene that evolved as protection against the brain diseases that can be consumed by eating human brain. Now, why else would this exist in our bodies if in fact our bodies didn't have to protect us from the potential damages that came from cannibalism? And so from this, they're going back now and re-looking at evidence to understand more about extensive human cannibalism in our early history. Keep in mind that many cases of cannibalism were not true. They were used for enslavement and for military force to enslave people. Columbus himself wasn't sure about what he saw, but it was easy for him to report that these people were in fact cannibals, and so he made that case. In many cases, it's meant to establish superiority. If you want to make your culture seem superior, all that you really need to do is to call them savage cannibals, and by virtue of the fact that they're cannibals, you're already better. You call them civilized or primitive or even inhuman. And this is a way then that they're able to pacify and kill and decimate these people and to treat them as less than human. An interesting tenet was that Queen Isabella forbade slavery except in the cases where people were cannibals. And so if you were a general or a captain and you were coming to these islands and you needed slaves, the quickest way to be able to get slaves was to call them cannibals and then quickly dispatch them as slaves, because it was the only way under Queen Isabella that you were able to claim them as slaves. In other countries, people were called subhuman eaters of men, and the goal was to firmly subjugate these people below Europeans. And so I offer you a little bit of food for thought. For those of you who are practicers of the Christian faith, I studied to be a priest myself for 8 years. And in the Gospel of John, it says, "Let me solemnly assure you, if you do not eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you have no life in you. He who feeds on my flesh and drinks my blood has life eternal." And so in the Christian Mass includes for many the consumption of the wafer and wine, which represents the Jesus' flesh and blood. For those of you who are Catholic, you believe in the premise of transubstantiation. That is at the moment of the blessing, when the priest lays his hand over the wafer and the wine, it automatically becomes the body and blood of Jesus Christ in that moment. Consubstantiation is used by some Protestant faiths, which is that the moment that you receive the body and blood of Jesus Christ, the wafer and the blood, the wine in your mouth, it becomes the body and blood of Jesus Christ. And then many other groups believe in symbolic presence, that in fact it's not really changed into Jesus' body and blood, but it is in fact meant to be a symbolic presence of Jesus in your midst at the sharing of the wine and the bread. So the purpose was that you were to consume the physical presence of Jesus, to acquire the divine nature of Jesus, his body, his blood, and his soul. And in fact, many of the early Christians were in fact tortured because of this belief. They were tortured, for one, because of the idea that they were in fact cannibals, because they were eating the body and blood of this man named Jesus, and also because they thought that they were incestual, because even husbands and wives called each other's brothers and sisters in Christ. And so it was one of the earliest means for putting to death these early Christians. And I can't close without a good cannibal joke. So, two cannibals got together for dinner, and the one cannibal said to the other one, "Hey, you start at the feet, and I'm going to start at the top." And they were really hungry. And after about 15 or 20 minutes, the guy who started at the neck area said, "Hey, boy, I haven't heard from my buddy for a while." So he said, "Hey, how you doing down there?" And the guy took his mouth away and said, "Hey, I'm having a ball." The guy says, "Hey, you're eating too fast." Thank you all very much for coming. We'll see you soon.